what's up everybody? Remy Sovereign here from RemySovereign.com. In today's new video, I'm going to address a question that I get asked almost all the time. And it's the million-dollar question that everyone wants an answer to. And that is, how long does it take for my disc bulge, or my disc herniation, or my sequestered disc to heal? Now to answer that question is that it really depends. And it depends on a number of factors. So when we consider a disc bulge, or disc herniation, sequestered disc, whatever it is, each of those disc injuries are, number one, different, and at the same time, let's just say, for example, if we had 3 people, all of them had disc bulges, we have to consider the location, the severity of the disc bulge, is it impinging on a nerve root or not, is it causing pain? We have to consider all those factors, and that's going to make the recovery process different for each individual. So not one individual is going to have the same rehab program or the same recovery time. Although the rehab programs may be very, very similar, there could be slight differences between them. Now, with that being said though, when we consider the recovery time for these types of injuries, we have to consider a number of factors. So the first factor I want to talk about is genetics. So if we have 2 individuals, individual 1 and individual 2, they have this, let's say they have the same disc bulge, the same location, it's impinging on a nerve root, and it's the same size. Now let's say individual 1 has an enhanced genetics that allows them to make a quicker recovery from an injury. So they're known for maybe recovering quicker from other injuries or whatever the case may be. Whereas individual 2 does not have that same genetic makeup that allows for that to occur. So when you have this occurring, that individual 1 may be able to make a quicker recovery than individual 2. And therefore you're going to have a change or difference in the recovery time it takes to heal that disc bulge, even though it may be the same type of disc bulge in the same area, same location, same severity. Individual 1, because of that enhanced kind of genetic makeup, could make a quicker recovery. Now when it comes to genetics, this is just a small factor that will influence the recovery process, but it's an important one to understand because it's going to create variability in terms of the recovery time for a disc type injury or any injury for that matter. Secondly, we can talk about nutrition. So nutrition is a controllable factor, and let's go back to individual 1 and individual 2. Let's say individual 1, let's say for their sake they have a very poor diet, whereas individual 2 now has a very good and healthy diet, and they're consuming a lot of good fruits, vegetables, they're getting their nutrients, minerals, and vitamins, whereas individual 1 isn't. So now, if that's the case, what can occur with the recovery process now is that individual 2, by consuming that healthy diet, they could speed up the recovery process because now they're enhancing their body's immune response, or they're enhancing various physiological mechanisms that are responsible for the recovery process of their disc injury. Whereas if individual 1 is lacking those nutrients, is not consuming a healthy diet, they could actually delay the recovery process and possibly make things worse in the long run. Because what it comes down to is nutrition is one of the most important factors in making a recovery from a disc injury, let alone any type of injury for that matter. And the reason being is because it's our body's physiological response which allows for healing to occur. So allowing for the reabsorption for the disc material, engaging that inflammation response, whether it's maybe increasing the macrophages or various immune response to the injury or the injured site to allow for healing to occur. And just to kind of touch on a little point, nutrition is often one of the most overlooked or ignored things when it comes to the recovery process of any sort of injury for that matter. And a lot of people typically will just look to exercises to treat their injury or do some certain exercise, and it doesn't exactly work that way. But with that being said, I'm going to move on to my next point there, and I'll just kind of touch back on nutrition in a second. But my next point leads me to, are you avoiding the activities or movements that cause pain? So if you have individual 1 and individual 2 again, so if individual 1, let's say, is avoiding all the activities and movements that cause pain, whereas maybe individual 2 works a desk job 8 hours a day and sitting is an activity that makes things worse. So if we consider this factor, if this individual 2, is sitting all day for 8 hours, whatever the case may be, or they're struggling to sit for 8 hours, they're only going to make things worse, and they're only going to delay the recovery process, because now that they're causing pain, they're creating potentially more inflammation, they can create more problems as well, and they're not allowing for the body to essentially make that proper physiological recovery response that it needs. Whereas individual 1, if they're avoiding all the activities and movements, then they're allowing for that body to significantly address that injury by creating that appropriate physiological healing response that it needs for the disc. And so that's another factor to consider when it comes to the recovery process, because if individual 1 is avoiding all activities and movements, then their recovery could be substantially quicker than the other individual that's not avoiding those movements or activities, and they're actually delaying the process, potentially even making things worse and causing more damage to the disc and causing more pain. And so that has to do with the physiological process as well. Because now, if I go back to nutrition, for example, if individual 2 here, the individual with the good diet, if they have the best diet, or whatever the case may be, but if they could have the best diet, but if they don't avoid those activities or movements, then that diet won't really do much for them, because they're only going to be creating more problems by engaging in those activities or movements that cause pain. And so therefore, it needs to be kind of a combined process, and every step needs to be tackled in order to get the most efficient and quick recovery. And so now, that brings me on to my next factor to consider, and that is exercises. So exercise itself is very important in the recovery process in terms of preventing a future injury from occurring. So when we talk about disc injuries, typically what we see is a lot of muscular imbalances or muscular weaknesses around the core. So maybe the deep internal stabilizers, rectus abdominis, obliques, something may be weak within that area, and that could maybe cause less stability to the spine. We don't have that same tolerance or capacity that we need to hold heavy loads or engage in certain activities, and so therefore we may be more susceptible to an injury. So when it comes to exercise, the more effective and efficient the recovery process is in terms of the individual engaging in the proper rehab program. So for instance, let's say individual 1 has a proper exercise rehab program, and individual 2 doesn't really have an effective program to prescribe maybe poor exercises. With individual 1 having a more effective rehab program from an exercise point of view, they'll be able to build up the strength, the endurance that they need to support their spine and prevent future injuries from occurring. So future disc injuries from occurring, and also to provide stability to that weak area where they may be susceptible to a bulge, herniation, or whatever the case may be. Whereas if individual 2 doesn't have an effective exercise plan, doesn't have an effective exercise program, then they could be maybe down the road potentially create a new injury. It may be more easily for them to create a new injury down the road because they don't have that strength or endurance to support their spine. They don't have that stability to support their spine. Or they may just have those imbalances that they haven't addressed, whether that's regards to their posture or whatever it may be. And so with regards to those factors, those are kind of more of the important factors that I just wanted to kind of touch on. So I kind of touched on genetics, nutrition, the exercises and activities to avoid, and then the exercise kind of rehab program itself. Now we can also talk about other factors like sleep, which is another important factor as well. And we can also talk about the psychological processes, like where your mindset's at, how you're feeling psychologically, because those can have also an effect on the recovery process as well if you don't have the right mindset. But the key thing here is what I want to suggest to you guys is that the recovery time for a disc injury is going to be very variable from one individual to another. So my disc injury is not going to be the same as another individual, and the recovery time is going to be a lot different. So when people ask me how long it takes for mine to heal, I'll usually tell them, it took me about close to 2 years to really make a full recovery. And to be honest, my rehab program through that time wasn't really effective until towards the end of the recovery, because that's when I kind of learned about disc injuries and learned about the proper rehab programs and just kind of took the time to understand everything, and then I was able to make a recovery myself. So let's say I had that effective recovery plan from the beginning, my recovery time may have been substantially shorter as opposed to being 2 years. So with that being said, guys, is that the big takeaway from this is that every disc injury is going to be different, and the recovery time is going to be different for every individual. Now, there may be a lot of similarities and overlap between each separate case, but there's not going to be one that's going to be identical to another. And that's the big thing that I just want to kind of talk about. And what I'm trying to say is, if you're someone that has seen someone make a recovery within 2 months from a disc bulge, and you're still at maybe 4 months recovery, don't get discouraged, because your disc injury is going to be different than theirs, and it's not going to be the same. And like I mentioned, you have to consider all those factors. Genetics, they may have better genetics. Maybe they have a better diet, maybe they have a better rehab program, whatever the case may be. However, with that being said though, if things are carrying on too long for you and you're not really noticing any improvements, then you may need to go back and look at your nutrition. You may need to go look back at your exercise rehab. You may need to go look back at, are you avoiding those activities movements, or are you getting enough sleep? You may have to go make some tweaks within your recovery in order to kind of make it more effective and see those improvements and ultimately get to that process where you're pain-free and you've made a full recovery. So guys, that's it for today's video, and I just wanted to kind of touch on that topic because I know it's a question I get asked almost all the time, and there's no perfect answer to that because every case is going to be different. However, with that being said, if you can address each of those categories that I mentioned, with the exception of genetics, you can substantially, especially if you combine those into the most effective recovery, if you combine those all efficiently, you could make a very substantial and effective recovery if you tackle each one of those categories effectively and very efficiently. So guys, that's it for today's video. I hope this video kind of provided you with a little bit of education about the recovery process of disc injuries. And it's also not, I wanted to kind of just mention to you guys to not feel discouraged for those of you that are maybe 6 months, maybe a year, or whatever the case may be, post-disc bulge, and you still have a lot of pain, haven't really noticed improvements. And the key thing is not to really compare yourself to another individual. Focus on yourself, focus on what's working, and address kind of those categories as need be. And so for that, guys, I'll leave it at that for today's video. If you have any questions or any comments, please leave them below. And also, if you haven't subscribed yet to my channel, please be sure to subscribe. And if you want to see more tips, more videos like this, be sure to give this a thumbs up and just let me know. Okay guys, I wish you guys all the best and a successful and productive day. Take care.